Hello and welcome. My name is Fredrik Wanger. I'm a classical musician, a pianist, and over the next 3 sessions, I will have the great pleasure of investigating with you a wonderful corner of the works of one of my, and I'm sure many others, most beloved composers, Johannes Brahms. We will be involved in an overview of the complete compositions for violin and piano, and will be joined in this endeavor by the brilliant violinist, conductor, and composer Alyssa Wang, of whom much more later. The fascinating part of this exercise lies in the fact that we must at the same time meet 3 other musicians, and not just any musicians, but 3 of the most illustrious names in the world of classical music, namely the composer Robert Schumann, his wife and musical soulmate, the superb pianist and composer Clara Schumann, and as we are discussing the works for violin and piano, we must also have a violinist somewhere in the picture. And oh boy, do we. Joseph Joachim, at 22, was a mere 2 years older than Brahms when they first met in 1853, but was already known throughout Europe and England as the leading string player and chamber music musician of the day. Let's briefly look at Brahms's life up to the age of 20. Born in 1833 to a financially sketchy but most loving family in Hamburg, Germany, his father was a serious musician, playing several instruments and ultimately securing a post in the Hamburg Philharmonic. The son's talent, like most of the great names of classical music, was recognized early, and after a few attempts, a fine teacher was found. Eduard Markson was an extremely well-trained pianist and composer, and quickly discovered in his young student a remarkable compositional bent. Markson was to remain a lifelong friend and would receive the young Brahms's compositions for his reaction for many years. In a very fortunate turn of affairs, when Brahms was 19, the wildly eccentric Hungarian Jewish violinist Eduard Remenyi found himself in Hamburg for a concert, but without a pianist. Inquiring at the local music store, the proprietor suggested the teenager, Johannes Brahms. Immediately recognizing this stroke of luck, the violinist suggested that they knock about Germany a bit, and when we get to Hanover, I'll introduce you to Joachim. Remenyi, whose real name was Eddie Hoffmann, and Joseph Joachim, a fellow Hungarian, were students of Professor Joseph Böhm in Vienna. The famous story from this period concerned a concert in which, when the great Beethoven C minor violin piano sonata began the program, the piano was a half-tone flat. No problem. Our young pianist, at sight, transposed this fiendishly difficult piece up a half step. I'm sure you pianists will realize what a staggering feat this was. Finally making it to Hanover and being introduced to Joachim, the youngster pulled out of his rucksack the Scherzo Opus 4 for piano, a violin sonata, a trio, a string quartet, 2 piano sonatas, and several songs. 50 years later, Joachim recalled, "Never in the course of my artist's life have I been so completely overwhelmed." It should be mentioned that Brahms had heard the 17-year-old Joachim 5 years earlier in Hamburg in the Beethoven Concerto, which was to become his signature piece. And Brahms, in his naivete, believed that Joachim was the composer. As an aside, when Robert Schumann conducted in Hamburg, the teenage Brahms had left off some of his compositions at the Composer's Hotel, only to have them returned unopened. I can imagine his sense of hurt at this rejection. Luckily for him, he got over it. At this time in Europe, the heart of classical music, especially in Germany and Austria, a very real musical divergence was taking place between the Liszt-Wagner schools of music, which enveloped theater and drama, and the pure, non-programmatic music as an end to itself school. As founder and editor of a very influential music journal, it was this last line, inherited from Beethoven, from which Schumann sought out like-minded composers in order to further their careers, but with increasing disappointment. Armed with a letter of introduction from Joachim, Friday at noon on September 30th, 1853, Johannes presented himself at the Schumanns on Belkerstrasse in Dusseldorf. One of the Schumann's daughters, Marie, opened the door for a young blonde lad with a backpack. Her parents were out, but could he come back tomorrow? And the youth, showing very good instincts, did. Greeted the next day by the 43-year-old Schumann, Brahms proceeded to begin playing when a touch on the shoulder stopped him to ask that he wait while Schumann fetched Clara. "Here, dear Clara, you shall hear such music as you have never heard before. Now, begin your sonata again, young man." Brahms, of course, knew of Clara as the most decorated pianist of Europe, man or woman, with only Franz Liszt, whose playing she generally disliked intensely, rivaling her in reputation. She was also a very accomplished composer. At this time, Clara was 34 and the mother of 7 children, with one on the way. When Brahms finished, Schumann patted him on the shoulder, saying only, "Young man, we understand each other," and extended an invitation to lunch the next day. Robert Laurens, a Schumann portrait artist and friend, at Schumann's request, produced these sketches of Brahms and the Schumanns. Clara wrote in her journal, "Here again is one as if sent by God. He played us sonatas and scherzos of his own, all of them rich in fantasy, depth of feeling, and mastery of form. Robert could see no reason to suggest any changes. It is profoundly moving to behold Brahms at the piano, his interesting young face transfigured by the music, his fine hands, which easily overcame the greatest difficulty. His things are very difficult. And above all, his marvelous works. A great future lies before him, for then he will have found the true medium for his imagination." Schumann's diary for the evening reads, "Visit from Brahms, a genius." Already thinking of using his powers of the press, Schumann wrote Joachim, "If I were younger, I might write a few rhapsodies about the young eagle who swooped down so suddenly in Dusseldorf from the Alps, or, to use another metaphor, the magnificent torrent which is at its best when, like Niagara, it dashes down as a cascade from the heights, while its shores are haunted by the butterfly and nightingale." I believe Johannes is another John the Baptist, whose revelations will puzzle many of the Pharisees, and everyone else for that, centuries. Only the other apostles will understand his message, including possibly Judas Iscariot. All this is for the apostle Joseph alone. You may have noticed that Schumann was not your run-of-the-mill writer. As a youth, his interest in literature and writing rivaled his love of music. He was among the best read of the great composers and was hugely stimulated by the writings of the German Romantics, especially Jean-Paul Richter. This photo gives the best idea of the delicate, blonde, almost girlish-looking young man. We are very used to the later, heavily bearded, pot-bellied Johannes, and it is good to be reminded of this young eagle. Schumann predicted verbal rhapsody indeed appeared on October 18, 1853. Let me read it to you now because I think it is important. Schumann's article in his highly respected Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, Journal for New Music, the article was prophetically entitled Neue Bahnen, New Paths. So at the age of 20, for ill or for good, Brahms was catapulted into the world of classical music, springing forth, as Schumann said, fully armed from the head of Jove. Let me say before reading that some of the English translation may sound a bit weird, but this is the standard translation. Many years have passed, almost just as many as I had earlier dedicated to the editorship of these pages, namely 10. And in those years are memories of such rich terrain which once made itself heard to me. Often from exerted productive activity, I felt stimulated. Some new important talents appeared. A new power in music seemed to announce itself, as shown by many of the high-rising artists of recent times, even if their productions are known mainly in narrow circles. I thought that it would, and that it must be, that someone would suddenly come along whose very calling would be that which needed to be expressed according to the spirit of the times and in the most suitable manner possible. One whose mastery would not gradually unfold, but, like Minerva, would spring fully armed from the head of Jupiter. And now he has arrived, a young blood, at whose cradle graces and hero kept watch. His name is Johannes Brahms, and he hails from Hamburg, where he works in dim seclusion, having been educated in the most difficult of the rules of art by a good teacher, Edward Markson. He actually carried, also outwardly, all signs which announced to us, this is an anointing. Sitting at the piano, he began to explore most wonderful regions. We were drawn into more and more magical circles by his playing, full of genius, which made of the piano and orchestra of lamenting and jubilant voices. There were sonatas, or rather veiled symphonies, songs whose poetry might be understood without words, piano pieces both of a demonic nature and of the most graceful form, sonatas for piano and violin, string quartets, each so different from every other that they seemed to flow from many different sources. And then it seemed as if all those rushing streams combined as in a waterfall, carrying over the downward converging waves, carried the peaceful rainbow, accompanied on the bank by the playing of butterflies and nightingale voices. Whenever he bends his magic wand there, when the powers of the orchestra and chorus lend him their aid, further glimpses of the magic world will be revealed to us. May the highest genius strengthen him. Meanwhile, the spirit of modesty dwells within him. His comrades greet him at his first entrance into the world of art, where wounds may perhaps await, but bay and laurel also. We welcome him as a valiant warrior, for there exists in every age a secret bond of like spirits. You who belong together draw the circle ever tighter, so that the truth of art shall burn more brilliantly and spread joy and blessing too. Let's talk a bit about the equally phenomenal ascent of Joseph Joachim into musical aristocracy at an even younger age. When the Jews were expelled from Vienna in 1670 by Emperor Leopold, many were given refuge and land by the Esterházy family in Hungary, in the area known today as the Burgenland in Austria. There were 7 communities, Sieben Gemeinden in German, and Sheva Kehilot in Hebrew. Joachim's family settled in Kitzay, one of the 7, but the family soon moved to Pest, which in 1873 was united with Buda and Óbuda to form Budapest. Again, like other huge talents, his gifts were quickly discovered and a teacher found. Advancing rapidly, he was aided by his cousin Fanny Figdor, who took the boy to Vienna, where he continued his studies with Professor Böhm, whom we mentioned earlier as the teacher of the wild Hungarian Remenyi. The chemistry between teacher and pupil was not good, and once again, cousin Fanny intervened and brought the boy to Leipzig to play for Felix Mendelssohn, who handpicked Joseph's tutors. Cousin Fanny was married to Karl Wittgenstein, a steel magnate, and one of the wealthiest men in Vienna. From this union came the extraordinary offspring of philosopher Ludwig, pianist Paul, who lost his right arm in World War I, and commissioned left-hand piano works from Ravel, Prokofiev, Britten, among others, and philanthropist daughter Margaret Stoneborough Wittgenstein. Mendelssohn took him to London for his debut at the age of 12 with the Beethoven Violin Concerto, then still a rarely played composition. The first and third movement cadenzas were composed by the young violinist. As a preteen, Joachim became the preeminent violinist in all of Europe. Upon Mendelssohn's tragically early death at 39, Joachim traveled to Weimar to become the concertmaster of the court orchestra and to immerse himself in the Liszt circle. Eventually, Joachim fell completely out of symphony with the emergence of Liszt's cult of personality and emphasis on extra musical elements inserting themselves into the fabric of composition. During a performance at the Lower Rhine Music Festival of the Beethoven Concerto, and observing Schumann's influence over that community, Joachim was convinced that this is where his musical heart lay. So you see that this group, Brahms, Joachim, and the Schumanns, were incredibly intertwined. And so many factors and coincidences were at play that if one chose to use the word destiny, I think it would be totally appropriate. Sadly, Robert was to die less than 3 years later in an asylum, his demons finally catching up with him. The manic-depressive condition of Schumann was such that in the manic phase, he wrote at a speed that musicologists rate with that of Schubert. Brahms visited him often, while sadly Clara was not allowed to see him until the day he died. For the next 41 years, Johannes and Clara would remain with several ups and downs, the most tightly bound soulmates. There is little doubt that early on, while Robert was alive and for a while thereafter, Brahms was madly in love with her. There is no evidence that it was ever more than this, and Brahms continued to send her his compositions for her input, and together they collaborated on editing Robert's works. Then in 1883, everything changed. Brahms inadvertently got in the middle of a messy divorce between Joachim and his wife, Amalie. As the jealous violinist accused his wife of cheating on him with Brahms's music publisher, a charge which Brahms did not believe. Brahms's sympathetic letter to Amelie ended up as evidence during the divorce proceedings, and it helped convince the court to rule in her favor. Part of the letter reads, "With no thought have I ever acknowledged that your husband might be in the right." At this point, I perhaps hardly need to say that even earlier than you did, I became aware of the unfortunate character trait with which Joachim so inexcusably tortures himself and others. The simplest matter is so exaggerated, so complicated, that one scarcely knows where to begin with it and how to bring it to an end. Aside from the works for piano and violin, Joachim was the muse for the violin concerto, dedicated to him, and incorporating his first movement cadenza, and the double concerto, which was written to make amends for the above-mentioned letter and was said to describe their different personalities. Before we dive into the sonatas, we must discuss Brahms's compositional techniques, sometimes referred to as developing variation. Being the great admirer and student of his predecessors, particularly Bach, he created a technique in which his compositions organically evolve from the main theme, which often were more like fragments, not only using repetition, but in a much more elusive and elusive manner. And these could be parts of the theme, the inversion of the theme, or the theme in different rhythms and different modes. I would like to play and discuss some of these techniques in a piano piece from Brahms's very last opus for piano, 4 pieces from Opus 119. This is the second of the 4, the E minor intermezzo. Let me play through the piece and then point out these musical threads. I use the word threads because I can think of no other analogy that works better than that of a fine Persian rug, and what we see and don't see when presented with this beauty. But if we are interested, can unravel and marvel at the inventiveness. So we're going to listen to this piece, talk about this piece a little bit. It's really Brahms's farewell to piano writing for solo piano, Opus 119. We're going to look at the second of them, which is an intermezzo, which the term intermezzo is kind of strange because it gives the impression that it's between something, and it's not between anything. And in the Romantic era, the intermezzo was kind of a fanciful term. Sometimes it was capriccio, sometimes rhapsody, sometimes romance. It seems that the intermezzo was possibly used for pieces that were not particularly heroic or tragic, but something in the middle. So what do we have to go on? We know that it's in E minor, which already gives us a little clue. I can think of 3 pieces. It's a rather unusual key for piano, for Brahms to use, although one could only look at the 4th Symphony, the great 4th Symphony, the end of his symphonic writing, the E minor Symphony, an early E minor cello sonata, a wonderful piece, and an even earlier scherzo in E minor. Brahms gives us clues as to the mood of the piece and the volume that he wants. Here we have andantino, un poco agitato, a little faster than andante, a little walking tempo, a little agitated. A little agitated is kind of hard to translate, and under that he writes piano, softly, sotto voce, kind of under your breath, e dolce, and sweetly. So there's quite a lot to go on. And then he starts the piece I'll just play the top line for a second. It's kind of weird, not exactly something you go around whistling. To that, he adds a lower voice. Then he adds the left hand on an offbeat, which kind of gives the unsettled agitato. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, comes this cry. There's no other way to put it. It's a sudden cry, which he marks SF, which means sforzando, which is a sudden accent. And he writes SOST, ... sostenuto, to hold it, to dwell on it. So once more. Then he goes on, repeats. Repetition is very important in music. It solidifies it in your brain. It gives you an anchor to come back to. I suppose there are equivalencies in literature too, but you have to have something good to repeat, and he certainly does. And he goes on. From our beginning motive, then repeated and elaborated on, and repeated, and there's that screaming interval. 4 times he plays it. Then he goes on, which is a form of the beginning, which was, now we have, he's just playing with that, and then he comes back. Now something entirely new. Or is it new? Our beginning was, and now we have same material, hidden, but it works its way into your brain. You can't quite remember this face, but it's somehow familiar. And that's the genius of Brahms's writing. It's different than other composers, and I'm just a poor pianist. I'm not a musicologist or a music theorist, but I can't think of other composers who play with their themes quite to the extent that Brahms does. And I can't refrain from saying that, I mean, he takes a thread and examines it under a microscope, and it's not lost on me that Sigmund Freud was working in Vienna at the same time Brahms was there. There's no evidence that they ever met, but if you can take apart a personality like Freud can, I think Brahms is every bit as prescient. So we have this in a different key. Now we're in A minor. stops, and then what? New material? Remember the beginning? Now we're in F minor. He's gone up a half step from E minor. So what do we have here? Same rhythm. And then again that screaming D sharp. And he's bringing this to a close. I think maybe by this time you would recognize the concluding section. Remember the beginning? Changes the intervals. He's using bigger intervals, 6 instead of thirds. Adding a different accompaniment. And listen how he builds this phrase until it reaches this just really emotional high point, starting softly and building over 4 measures, ever climbing in pitch. Once, twice, 3 times, and then he ends on a very important chord in Western music. This is called the dominant. A piece in this era cannot end on this chord. It has to resolve itself to that. But he doesn't. He goes on to the real magical part. I like to think of what has come before as sounds a little bit Robert Schumann-esque, but as a metamorphosis. And what comes now is this gorgeous butterfly. And it emerges in the shape of a waltz. And remember that Brahms lived the end of his life, the last 25 years, in Vienna. He wrote many waltzes. His Opus 39 waltzes are, for piano 4 hands, are masterpieces. In a way, this, I feel, maybe was a farewell to Vienna, perhaps, something in there. I may be reading too much into it. But, so, what do we have now? Starts on that same pitch that which led us to a minor key, but now we have new material? No. Remember the beginning? It's the same material, different rhythm in the major instead of the minor. Now I'd like to give this, run this piece from the beginning, and hopefully my travel log will give you some points of interest along the way. Brahms said that finding lovely melodies was no problem, and that in his lovely summer resorts, they were virtually falling off the trees. What to do with them, how to nourish them, and make them grow, that was the issue.